Ricardo had always considered himself fortunate and was utterly convinced that one day he would achieve great success. This confidence had been instilled in him since childhood by his mother, Helen, who believed him to be talented and deserving of happiness more than anyone else. Her words always echoed in his ears whenever he faced difficulties, pushing him forward. Indeed, Ricardo succeeded. He had secured a good job at a large company where he was valued and respected. His boss, an older man named Mr. Adams, favoured him, and Ricardo had every reason to believe he was on the right path. His personal life was also going well. A few years ago he had married Zoe, a beautiful young woman whom he found a bit simple-minded, but he saw this as an advantage. From his perspective, a wife should never surpass her husband in any way, and should always consider him not just the head of the family, but the master of her life. And so it was. Zoe worked at a consulting company. Though her job offered no significant prospects, she didn't mind this, except for the occasional hurt she felt when her husband teased her about her modest social status. What bothered Zoe more was the absence of children in their marriage. She was willing to see doctors and undergo treatment, but her husband initially discouraged her and eventually put an end to these attempts. "Stop it, Zoe," he said one day. "If we don't have children now, it means we don't need them right now. They'll come eventually, but for now, we're doing just fine without them." Zoe was hurt, but she had grown accustomed to obeying her husband. She didn't know that, secretly, Ricardo thought the lack of children might work in his favour some day. Now, more and more often, he thought that he deserved someone much more glamorous. But overall, things were going very well for Ricardo. Recently, the owner of their firm had fallen seriously ill, giving Ricardo hope that, in the event of Mr. Adams's death, he might receive a significant promotion, perhaps even something better. "You think he'll leave the company to you?" his mother asked, barely containing her excitement. But Ricardo's ambitions didn't stretch that far. "Come on, Mum, he has a son. He'll probably inherit everything," Ricardo replied, rubbing his hands together. "But isn't that son abroad somewhere?" Helen wondered. "People can return from abroad, especially for such a present," Ricardo smirked. "No, I'm not counting on anything that grand, but he could at least make me a vice-president. After all, his son won't stay here forever. He'll go back abroad, and I'll be in charge of everything. Then the company will be mine. It's just a matter of time." Ricardo was quite pleased with himself and his cunning plan, believing that the realization of his dreams was just around the corner. But things didn't turn out as he had hoped. One day he returned from work looking dejected. "My boss is really sick, and he's already called his son, and he said something that left me speechless," Ricardo replied, taking off his jacket and tossing it onto a chair. "He decided to give me something, but not the company, and not even a managerial position. He bequeathed me, of all things, his apiary. He was fond of it in his spare time." "An apiary? With bees?" Helen asked, bewildered. "Yes, with bees, flies, and mosquitoes," Ricardo replied irritably. "I don't know why he needed this joy, but he used to go there on weekends and during vacations, supposedly seeking tranquility. They say beekeepers are wise and live very long lives, but my boss wasn't so lucky with longevity. Now he thinks I should handle it." "This is just ridiculous," his mother almost cried. "What are you going to do with an apiary? I don't understand." "I'm not going to do anything with it. I'll sell it, that's all," Ricardo declared. "Let the bees buzz around, but the land and maybe the house is worth something." Ricardo sighed heavily, feeling his dreams of great success crumbling. But he was not ready to give up. He knew he would find a way to regain his confidence and achieve what he deserved. Zoe timidly suggested, "We could sell honey. It's quite valuable." Her voice trembled and she nervously fidgeted with the edge of the tablecloth, She had always been quiet and never interfered in her husband's and mother-in-law's business conversations. Recently she had been laid off, and that's why she felt she had no right to speak up, let alone offer advice. Ricardo, hearing her suggestion, grew angry. His eyes flashed, and he turned sharply to his wife. The room fell into a tense silence, broken only by the ticking of the antique clock on the wall. "Well, if you're so smart, you go ahead," he said, crossing his arms. "Take care of the bees, sell the honey, do whatever you want. You're just idling in the city anyway." Zoe shrank under his gaze, feeling her heart sink. "But, Ricardo, I don't know anything about it," she whispered, taking a step back. "Why would I go there? Especially alone, and I'm afraid of bees." "There's nothing to be afraid of," Ricardo dismissed her, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Besides, someone must be looking after the apiary. The boss said he had some assistant, probably an old beekeeper with a beard and a special hat on his head. But we need to keep an eye on our property, so you, as a jobless, should do that." Soon after this conversation, Mr. Adams passed away. Ricardo, having inherited the strange property, began to urge his wife to act. "Come on, Zoe, get ready and go check on the land and apiary," he said, trying to sound caring, though his voice betrayed his irritation. "Make sure everything is in order. We can't just leave it unattended. It might get robbed. It needs supervision." In truth, Ricardo cared little about the apiary. He simply thought that by sending his wife out of the city, he would finally gain the freedom he desired and fulfill his dream of having a mistress, a young and beautiful one, befitting his status as a successful young man. Zoe had no desire to go anywhere, especially since it was hurtful that her husband was so eager to send her away to the countryside. But there was nothing for her to do in the city any more. She remembered her childhood summers spent at her grandparents' village home, the best times of her life. Perhaps it would be better to spend some time away from the city and the constant reproaches. Helen, her mother-in-law, approached Zoe and gently patted her on the shoulder. Her eyes were filled with sympathy and warmth. "Don't worry, Zoe," she said softly. "I'll come visit you. It's not far." Zoe nodded, feeling tears well up in her eyes. Nevertheless, she made up her mind, packed a few things, got into the old car, and set off. The journey to the apiary was long and tiring. Zoe watched out of the window as the cityscape gave way to rural landscapes. Fields, forests, and occasional villages flashed by, and she felt the tension gradually leaving her. When she finally arrived, she was greeted by a well-maintained plot and neat beehives and blooming gardens, and small but cosy house. Zoe stepped out of the car and took a deep breath of the fresh air, filled with the scent of flowers and honey. She had no idea what she was supposed to do at the apiary, or what order she was meant to maintain, but it turned out everything was in perfect order. 10 minutes later, she met the young man who tended to the bees and hives. His name was Bradley, and he was not an old, bearded man. On the contrary, he was tall and slim, with tanned skin and bright blue eyes. His hands were strong and confident, and his movements were graceful. He wore simple work clothes, but looked stylish and well-groomed. Zoe couldn't help but admire him, feeling her cheeks flush. "Hello," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Zoe, Ricardo's wife. We are the new owners of this apiary." Bradley smiled and shook her hand firmly. "Hello, Zoe. I'm Bradley. Nice to meet you." They exchanged a few words, and Zoe felt that Bradley seemed reliable and responsible. One day, Zoe met her elderly neighbour, Eleanor, who lived alone in an old house. Eleanor was a kind and friendly woman, and she immediately took a liking to Zoe. They sat on a bench outside Eleanor's house, sipping tea with honey and chatting leisurely. "Don't be afraid of him. He's a good lad," Eleanor said, patting Zoe's hand. "Unfortunate, yes, but that's how life turned out for him." "What do you mean?" Zoe asked, puzzled. Eleanor sighed and shook her head. "Bradley has a criminal past," she explained. "He spent several years in a prison." Zoe was shocked. She couldn't believe that this young, attractive man could have such a dark past. "That's strange," she muttered. "He looks normal and doesn't act like an ex-con. He has no prison tattoos or jailhouse talk." "He was wrongly convicted," continued Eleanor, her voice filled with sympathy. "I knew his parents. They were decent people. He graduated from medical school and wanted to be a paramedic. I don't know the details, but I think he had an argument with a doctor over a girl, and the doctor set him up. That's how Bradley ended up in the penal colony. But look at him now. He didn't let it break him. He's not a criminal. He works hard, and no one has a bad word to say about him. Now people from the village even come to him for medical help, and he never refuses or asks for money. He's a good man, unlike my grandson, Tom." "You have a grandson?" Zoe asked, surprised. Eleanor sighed heavily. "Unfortunately, yes. My daughter passed away, poor thing, and my son-in-law disappeared. Tom has been trouble since he was little, in and out of jail, never visits me. Why would he? I'm just an old woman to him. He's probably just waiting for me to die so he can get his inheritance." Zoe felt a warmth in her heart for this old woman who had been through so much. She realized that everyone has a story filled with pain and disappointment, but also hope. As Zoe spent more time with Bradley, she was impressed by his kindness and skill as a beekeeper. "I'm amazed at how the bees seem to understand you," she remarked, watching him tend to the hives with ease. "I just love them and know what they need," Bradley explained with a smile. "There's no magic to it." Soon, Zoe no longer felt upset about being sent to live in the countryside. She befriended Bradley and grew close to Eleanor, almost like family. Zoe lived in a small house on the apiary, while Bradley stayed in a separate cabin nearby. They remained friends and nothing more, as Zoe always remembered that she was married, even though her husband seemed to have forgotten about her. And he truly didn't think about Zoe anymore. Why bother with a wife he had grown tired of, whose feelings for him had long faded, when he had Nora, a young beauty from their company? Nora didn't hint at formalizing their relationship, and Ricardo himself wasn't thinking about it, as he wasn't yet sure about the divorce. He revelled in his new life, full of passion and ambition, unaware that Zoe, left behind at the apiary, was finding her own happiness in the simple joys of rural life. His mother, of course, found out, but she wouldn't betray her own son, although she certainly didn't approve of his behaviour. She said nothing, only shook her head disapprovingly upon learning of his affair. Zoe might have suspected how her husband was behaving, but she no longer cared. She had become engrossed in her work at the apiary, enjoying nature and conversations with new friends. One particularly hot day, Eleanor suddenly lost consciousness. Zoe rushed to her side, her heart pounding with fear. She called an ambulance and shouted for Bradley. "Bradley, hurry!" she cried, panic rising in her voice. Bradley quickly assessed the situation and began performing CPR. His movements were confident and precise, and within minutes, Eleanor began to regain consciousness. By the time the paramedics arrived, she was breathing on her own, though fragile. "She can't be left alone in this condition," the paramedic said after examining her. "She needs to be hospitalized." Zoe nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. She knew she would have to look after Eleanor's house, and it was the least she could do for her friend. And soon Zoe met Tom, Eleanor's grandson. He had heard about his grandmother's illness and rushed to the village, his eyes gleaming with greed. He didn't care about the house itself, but wanted to sell it for money. However, with his grandmother still alive, he couldn't do anything. "Hello, I'm Tom," he introduced himself, eyeing the house with interest. "So, my grandmother is in the hospital?" "Yes," Zoe replied, trying to hide her disapproval. "She needs time to recover." Tom nodded, but his intentions were clear. Meanwhile, Ricardo also arrived at the apiary, and he was going to announce his final plans for bees. "Hey, Zoe," he said, hugging her. "I found buyers for the bees." "What do you mean?" Zoe asked, alarmed, pulling away. "We've taken such good care of them. And why?" "Well, good job," Ricardo replied with a shrug. "It's great that the apiary is in good shape. It'll be easier to sell. But don't worry, you can still live here. I'm only selling the bees, not the land and the house." Zoe was devastated. She had poured her heart into caring for the apiary, and the thought of losing it all was painful. Besides, she had been donating the honey to a nearby orphanage, where she had befriended a boy named Diego, whom she hoped to adopt. Of course, she needed Ricardo's consent, but she hoped he wouldn't object. Bradley was also upset about the potential sale and offered a solution. "Zoe," he said when they were alone, "I know how important this is to you. Let's try to find another way. Maybe we can convince Ricardo not to sell the bees. Or maybe we could move the bees to another location. I found a nice clearing surrounded by dense forest. No one will find them there, and when things settle down, we can move them back. I need to think about moving them away. Anyway, first I'll try to convince my husband not to sell them," Zoe said, with her face worried. The next day she went to the city, and to her great surprise, she discovered about her husband's mistress. She accidentally met an old acquaintance who worked at the same company as Ricardo. Unaware that Zoe knew nothing, she told her about Nora, a young and beautiful employee with whom Ricardo had been having an affair for some time. Zoe listened, feeling her hands tremble with anger and pain. "I can't believe it," she whispered when her friend finished the story. "I'm sorry, Zoe," her friend said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I thought you knew." Zoe shook her head, feeling tears well up in her eyes. "No, I didn't know. But thank you for telling me. At least now I know the truth." This revelation was a shock, but it also became a catalyst for change. She realized she could no longer live in the shadows, obeying Ricardo's will and enduring his neglect. She felt her heart breaking. She remembered all the moments when Ricardo had been cold and indifferent, all his sarcastic remarks and contemptuous looks. Now it all made sense, and she understood that she no longer wanted to be a victim. Returning to the apiary, Zoe felt a newfound determination burning within her. She was no longer willing to remain silent and obedient. Therefore, she and Bradley put his plan into action. When Ricardo arrived and started shouting about the missing bees, Zoe met his gaze with a steadfastness she had never shown before. "Where are the bees?" Ricardo shouted, his face red with anger. "The bees are not here, Ricardo," Zoe calmly replied, not flinching. "We moved them to a safe place." "How dare you!" he roared, clenching his fists. "I told you I found buyers." "And I told you I wouldn't let you sell them," Zoe replied firmly, not flinching. "And besides, I know about your mistress. We are getting divorced. I suggest you leave me the bees and the house, and you can take our apartment in the city. This apiary and the house are worth half the value of our joint property." After a moment of hesitation, Ricardo decided that a divorce and Zoe's plan would be a great solution, after all. He was doing just fine with Nora, and Zoe could keep her bees, as long as she didn't claim the city apartment. However, Ricardo's situation took a turn for the worse when the rightful heir of Mr. Adams's arrived at the office. Frederick introduced himself to all the employees, and Ricardo noticed that the young owner looked at him not just without sympathy, but with suspicion and dislike. "Congratulations on taking over the company," Ricardo couldn't help but say to the heir, trying to appear friendly. "I hope our relationship will be as good as it was with your father. We were practically friends." "Yes, I've heard," Frederick replied with a sarcastic smile, his eyes narrowing. "I even know that my father left you something. As his best friend, perhaps." "Yes, probably," Ricardo muttered, feeling a chill run down his spine. "It's the apiary," Frederick added, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But I didn't ask for it. He gave it to me." Ricardo began to justify himself. Of course you didn't ask, but you got a nice inheritance. The apiary is one thing, but the plot of land, as far as I know, is worth a lot." Frederick gave Ricardo a meaningful look before ending the unpleasant conversation. Ricardo realized that storm clouds were gathering over him. He clearly hadn't made a good impression on the new owner, mainly because of the apiary. Frederick didn't say anything directly, but with each passing day he made working conditions increasingly difficult for Ricardo. Then Nora, instead of supporting Ricardo, switched her allegiance to Frederick. This was the final straw. Ricardo felt his world crumbling, leaving him alone, without support or hope for a better future. One day, right at work in front of other employees, Ricardo couldn't hold back and said nasty things to the new boss about how unfair it was for him to come in and take credit for everything Ricardo had done. The office fell into a deathly silence. All the employees froze, unable to believe their ears. Frederick slowly turned to Ricardo, his face stone cold. "Ricardo," he said coldly, "your words are highly inappropriate. Please leave the office immediately." Ricardo realized he had crossed a line. He had no choice but to resign. At first, he wasn't too upset, confident that a specialist of his caliber would be in high demand anywhere. However, at his first attempts to find a new job, he realized that his rank wasn't as high as he thought, and other companies weren't eager to hire him. He, who had always considered himself lucky and indispensable, suddenly found himself completely alone. His wife was almost gone. His mistress had betrayed him, and even his mother, instead of offering sympathy, only scolded him. "So you've decided to live off me now?" Helen asked sarcastically. "My pension isn't much. How long do you think I can support you?" "Mum, can't you just be quiet?" Ricardo exclaimed in anguish. "Don't you understand the situation I'm in?" "And whose fault is that?" his mother retorted. "I don't know what you did at work to get fired, but you're the one who decided to divorce Zoe. You should have held on to a wife like her. At least then you wouldn't be sitting alone in your cave." Ricardo felt his world crumbling. Always confident in himself and his abilities, he now found himself at a dead end. Meanwhile, the day of the final divorce proceedings was approaching. Initially, he had even been happy about it, especially since he had Nora, but now he understood that his mother was absolutely right. Ricardo found himself in complete solitude, and a few days before the trial, decided to visit the village to make amends. He was certain that his wife still loved him and would naturally forgive him, and everything would be wonderful again. At the very least, he wouldn't be alone. However, upon arriving at the apiary, he realized he was too late. "Of course I remember about our divorce, and I am going to come on time. No need to worry, Ricardo," Zoe said cheerfully, her voice steady and confident. "This faithful date is in a few days." "No, Zoe, I'm not here to remind you," Ricardo replied, trying to sound sincere. "On the contrary, I would like to mention that we don't need to get divorced. We were happy together, and still can be." "Are you kidding?" Zoe almost exclaimed in fright, her eyes widening in disbelief. "No, we can't be together. I'm really looking forward to our divorce because I'm getting married to someone else. Bradley, come here, please," she called out. A young man emerged from the house, his face calm and composed. Zoe introduced him with a smile. "Meet my future husband." "What?" Ricardo exclaimed in outrage, his face turning red. "Do you even realize what you're doing? You're going to tie your life to some recidivist? Do you want to spend your life waiting for him to get out of prison after his next crime?" But Bradley smiled, his eyes filled with determination. "You're mistaken," he said calmly. "First, Zoe knows everything about my past and my present. I'll be living here now, and I've already found a steady job. I have no intention of going back to prison." This was the truth. Bradley had found work at the very nursing home where there was a shortage of paramedics and nurses. He was hired with pleasure. Moreover, he had the opportunity to personally care for Eleanor, whom her grandson had placed in the same nursing home. Zoe and Bradley were going to take in the kind grandmother, who was greatly saddened by feeling unwanted at the end of her life. Realizing he had lost all chances, Ricardo left with anger. Soon, Zoe finalized the divorce, and she and Bradley got married. They fully registered the apiary in their names and took in Eleanor and little Diego, who was already waiting for his new mum and dad to pick him up. Ricardo, on the other hand, had a tough time. He never found a job that satisfied his ambitions. He got by with small one-time jobs and wasn't ashamed to accept help from his mother, who, despite her small pension, had to support him. Zoe, however, did not forget her former mother-in-law and sent her honey several times a year to support her health. Life in the village continued to flourish, filled with the hum of bees and the laughter of children. Zoe and Bradley found happiness in their simple, honest life, while Ricardo was left to grapple with the consequences of his actions, learning the hard way that true success comes not from ambition, but from love and humility.